Her mystery novels set in Korea's Joseon Dynasty have captivated readers around the world. Korean-Canadian author Hur June, or Hur June in Korean, won the 2023 Edgar Award for Best Young Adult for her novel The Red Palace, or 붉은 궁. Through her books, she has been introducing Korea's history and culture to readers around the world. And today, we're meeting author Hur June here in the studio. Welcome, June.
Hi, June. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm so honored.
We are very honored to have you here with us today, June. So first and foremost, could you say hello to our viewers, introduce yourself maybe a little bit, and also what have you been up to in Korea right now?
Yes. Hi, my name is June, and I am just someone who is obsessed with Korean historical fiction, and I know there are many people who love Korean history and Korean culture in general, and so yeah, like my books, I always like to talk of my books as a Korean drama in book form.
A Korean drama in book form. I love that. So as I mentioned before, June, you won the 2023 Edgar Award for Best Young Adult, and that's for your book, The Red Palace. I think you also have it there today with us. So yes, could you briefly introduce your novel?
So The Red Palace, it's basically about a palace nurse, an 의녀, and she teams up with a 종사관, and that is like an inspector, police inspector, to solve a string of grisly murders. And this mystery centers on the history of Prince Sado, Sadoseja. So that's kind of the history that I explore with the mystery.
Okay.
Wow. So you have written several mystery stories, and they're all kind of set in Joseon Dynasty, including, of course, the Red Palace over there. So among all the different periods in Korean history, what's your reason behind choosing specifically Joseon Dynasty as your setting?
So the easy, straightforward answer is I grew up watching a lot of historical K-dramas, 사극, and some of my favorite dramas were like 동의 and 대장금. And when I was watching these shows in Toronto, because I grew up in Toronto, in my brain it didn't click that this is actually based on real history. I just watched it and I was like, oh, it felt almost like a fantasy to me as a Canadian kid. And so one day when I was an adult, I realized actually all the historical K-dramas that I grew up watching and loving, they're actually based on real history. And it's so obvious to a lot of people, but for me, a kid who grew up with very little exposure to Korean history, I didn't make that connection until later on. And so because I grew up loving Joseon dramas, that was the history that I really wanted to explore. And so every book I write, I kind of call my history class. So it's like for the 붉은 궁, the Red Palace, I was interested in Sadoseja, Prince Sado, and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna write a book based on this historical background, so I have an excuse to research but also get paid for a living. And they're all mysteries because to me history, as a kyopo, as a diaspora Korean history is like a mystery, and so I use mystery as a vehicle to explore Korea's past.
That's fascinating. And just quickly for our international viewers, the Joseon Dynasty would be one of the kingdom dynasties starting in 1392, I guess, and lasting for more than 500 years. So, but I mean, June, you're researching the past and crafting fiction, so it must be quite difficult to, incorporate Korea's history and culture into these fictional stories. So you did mention that you've got a good excuse to make that research. So how does your research proceed? I mean, do you refer to books or how does it work?
So what I begin with is when I begin researching, I kind of start with like a history 101. So I want to get the general gist of the historical period I'm studying about. And there's a lot of so early on, when my Korean wasn't as good, I relied a lot on the works of Korean American scholars. There's a famous scholar, her name is Joseon Habush, and she's translated a lot of primary Korean sources, but also she's written on the Joseon period a lot. And so I rely on her books a lot. And because I write crime, one of my favorite books is Wrongful Deaths. And this book kind of explores how the legal system was like in the Joseon period, And then my absolutely favorite historical resource is the Epistolary Korea. So there are a whole bunch of letters written in the Joseon Dynasty translated into English. And so I find that reading letters by Koreans, it really captures, what was it like, life in Korea in the Joseon period. But at the end of the day, I'm a diaspora Korean, and I understand that, no matter how much I research, there will always be a gap in my understanding. And so when I was first writing my books, I was very insecure about that, and I felt very scared. I remember when I wrote my first book, I was just like, oh my gosh, I hope Korea never finds my book, because what if I'm doing this all wrong, even though I'm doing my best, right? So there was that fear, but I remember once when I wrote my second book, The Science of Bones, and it got translated into, I think, 숲 속에 사라진 소녀들. When I wrote that book, there was just so much anxiety, and then I called my mom once, and then I was like, 엄마, I will never be able to write a fiction like a Korean who is born and raised and educated in history. And so I had such insecurity about that. But then my mom is like, oh, when you speak in Korean, you speak with an accent. But she's like, accents are beautiful. They bring perspective and they bring an extra story to it. And so I think I realized, you know what, I am a diaspora Korean. There are gaps in my understanding, and I'll do my best, but I'll never write like a Korean, raised and educated. And that's okay, because the table for stories is wide, and after my books got translated, I realized there is a place for me at the table. And the way that Korea has received my work felt like a very warm welcoming. So yeah, that's the story.
Wow.
We are so happy that Korea found your books and that we now can read it in Korean as well here.
Definitely. And your story definitely connects with me as well, because you said you're from Toronto, you were born in Korea, and I was actually born in Korea and raised in Toronto or Canada as well. So I'm very in connection with you. But I want to ask you, how does kind of, your background and identity as Korean Canadian influence your writing?
Yeah, so for most of my life, I was actually very interested in British history. And so I wrote a lot of British historicals. And so I think the way I understand literature and the way I want to convey a story has been shaped by the Western literature that I've read. And when I went to the University of Toronto, I majored in history. And the way history is kind of the way you see and approach history in the West, I feel like it's probably different than Korea. I don't know, because I've never studied history here. But in the West, we focused a lot, at least in my classes, we focused a lot on the lives of women. And there were a lot of theories and a lot of tools that I received to explore, how did women live back then? And I think as a Korean myself, but I didn't spend most of my life in Korea. So I always wondered, what would it be like if I lived in the Joseon 시대? And so I think because of my Western education, but just as a woman in general, the way I write, it's very shaped in a way where I'm focused on what was it like for women back in Joseon 시대. And then as a Korean Canadian, I'm looking at Korean history from afar. And so I kind of see it as when you're living in your house all your life, it becomes you're very used to it, right? But when I feel like I'm a guest, and I'm just like, oh wow, look at this portrait. Oh my gosh, your couch, your design is amazing. Who's your designer? So there's it's this new perspective I feel like that I can bring to the table. So everything is so new to me. And so I think my stories are shaped by that kind of ooh, so interesting.
And I mean, many international readers probably learn about Joseon Dynasty through your books, encounter about it for the first time. So I think that also brings a bit of responsibility. Yes. And I guess that was why you were talking about that, the insecurity at the beginning. But what do you want readers to take away from your books?
So as I'm studying about the Joseon period, on one side, I feel like it is a mirror where I'm learning so much about myself. But at the same time, I've studied a lot of histories around the world, and I find that at the end of the day, humans are humans. We all want love. We all want a place to belong. We all want a decent life when we're not being oppressed. So I feel like there's a commonality in every history you explore around the world. And so what I want to bring to the table with my books is just like the importance of kindness and justice. And that teen girls who grew up in a time when they're expected to just stay at home, like they have the right to pursue justice as well. So that's, yeah, like for me, it's always about like, you know, life is hard, let's be a bit kind to each other. And that's always the heart of all my stories.
Right. And now we want to talk about the Silence of Bones, that book that you just touched upon,
Yes.
잃어버린 이름들의 낙원 in Korean. It was actually recently translated into Korean, right?
I
So
know.
for people who haven't read yet, could you please briefly introduce the book and also what it's about?
Yes, so 잃어버린 이름들의 낙원. So it is about, the heroine is a Tamo, and she is basically Tamo is like a police servant girl who serves in the police bureau. And there's also a K-drama called Tamo from many years ago that was really famous. But yeah, the protagonist is a Tamo, and she teams up with the police inspector to solve crime. And the background, and then one of the victims is actually a Catholic. And this was during a time when there was a lot of tension between traditional Confucianism and Catholicism. And so this book kind of explores that tension. So the historical background of 잃어버린, I can't even, 이름들의 낙원 is the 신유박해 of 1801.
And 잃어버린 이름들의 낙원's English original title would be The Silence of Bones, right? And June, so far you've explored the stories of various female protagonists on the backdrop of the Joseon Dynasty.
Yes.
Would there be any other maybe parts of the past or maybe other figures that I would like to explore in the future?
So this is a fun question because it was something I've wanted to explore for so long, but I just didn't know how. So basically, I kind of shared I was really interested in British history, and I actually fell in love with novels because my dad introduced me to Pride and Prejudice. And so I was obsessed with Pride and Prejudice. I love Jane Austen. Jane Austen is the reason why I began writing. But then when I switched over to writing Joseon Dynasty era books, I was always like, I'm writing these books, but I really miss the world of Jane Austen. But I didn't want to leave Joseon to go to Regency era England. But then one day I was like, what about if I let the two worlds just collide? And so in a sense, if you think of all the K-dramas, historical K-dramas, it kind of is like Pride and Prejudice in Joseon. And so when I was writing my Pride and Prejudice inspired historical, I had to find a way to write 오만과 편견, Pride and Prejudice, but also introduce something new. And so I think I have a copy. So this is like my newest book, Behind Five Willows. And I call it Pride and Prejudice meets You've Got Mail. And the historical backdrop that I explore is the 문체반장, which is it was a censorship by King Jeongjo on prose and literature. And so yeah, that was actually what I really wanted to write, and then I ended up writing it.
Wow. You know, the moment you mentioned British history, I was actually thinking of, wouldn't it be great if we could have like British and Korean history combined and then maybe make it into a K-drama later in the books as well? If any,
Please
is anyone working in production right now?
There's like parallels, so many parallels. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, June, for joining us today on the show. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for sharing a story and the story about your stories. It was a pleasure. Thank you
so much.
And thank you, Bella, as always. We're going to see you back here tomorrow.
Yes, I'll see you tomorrow.